Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
Welcome everybody to the Stoa. I'm going to do my own words for the intro because I forget what the typical tagline is. But for me, it's a place where thinkers of many different styles meet to explore new ideas, experiment with different practices, and dialogue about what matters most on the knife's edge. Something like that. Just before we begin, this session will be recorded. So if you don't want to appear on YouTube, feel free to turn your camera off. For everyone else, we love to see your face, so feel free to turn your camera on if you'd like. We're going to start this 60-minute session with our guests, Oliver and Ben, sharing about their work with LessWrong. And then we're going to open things up for a Q&A. At any point, feel free to drop some questions into the chat, and I'll call upon you to either read your question out loud, or you can also say, hey, Narayan, I'd like you to read this question, and I'll read that out loud for you. So I'm Narayan. Peter asked me to facilitate this STOA session because I've been a part of the rationality community for about the last 5 years, which is when I first read the Sequences, which is a series of essays on LessWrong. It actually transformed how I saw the world, how I thought, and I think it made me a much more effective and better person. So have a soft spot in my heart for this community that I still consider myself to be a part of. I also founded a rationality training program in Toronto called Think Better, and I can see a couple folks from that community is here. And I have also trained with the Center for Applied Rationality. I first met Oliver at a LessWrong party in Berkeley, but I don't know if he remembers that. Okay, thumbs up. And I occasionally bump into Ben and Oliver in some of the community gatherings. So I'm really excited to introduce them. Oliver is the current project lead for LessWrong, where he tries to build the infrastructure to make intellectual progress on global catastrophic risks, cause prioritization, and the art of rationality. He used to work at the Center for Effective Altruism US as their strategic director, and he ran the EA Global Conferences for 2015 and 2016 as an instructor for the Center for Applied Rationality. Oh, and as an instructor at CPAR. And Ben Pace is a site admin and also a great author on LessWrong. And he first read the Sequences when he was 13 years old. To contrast that with me, I was 27. So I can only imagine the impact that LessWrong has had on Ben and the impact that Ben has had with LessWrong. Ben has also organized an Effective Altruism Global Conference, and he's worked to publish a series of essays from LessWrong in physical book format. So welcome. Oh yeah, and you can see the books there. They are beautiful. So I guess let's kick things off, and maybe Oliver and Ben, if you guys want to. Peter, you have them too? Oh, okay, I need to order my copy too. So I'll pass things over to Oliver and Ben. Maybe just describe a little bit about what is LessWrong? What is rationality? And what's exciting about it? What's exciting for you? Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ryan, for that lovely intro.
Thank you. Indeed.
Yeah, Habryka, do you want to tell people a little about the history of LessWrong?
Yeah, I mean, it might just be good to start a bit with the history. I mean, just like to kind of bring everyone up to speed very roughly on what LessWrong even is. I think it roughly all started with L.A. Zudkowsky in something like 2008, starting to write a long series of essays that Ryan mentioned earlier called The Sequences. At the time, he was writing an Overcoming Bias, which some people might know, the blog that now primarily has Robin Hanson blogging on it. And at the time, he was trying to write a series of essays that explained how he thought good thinking was supposed to work and kind of trying to make incremental progress towards what a good art of thinking might look like. And he ended up getting quite a bit of following. And a lot of his thoughts were kind of through the lens of modern cognitive science combined with a lot of artificial intelligence, but with a kind of philosophy that was a lot broader than something like the modern, more falsificationist view of science or something like that, I would like to try to put it into different philosophy of science buckets. I really like to think of Elias's philosophy kind of being pretty similar to Francis Bacon, which is more on the something like try to figure out a coherent art of like all of like how thinking is supposed to work and how cognition is supposed to work and what good inferences mean. Whereas like sometimes when you think of science, you think of things like, we propose a hypothesis and then we go and test it. And it's this much more experimental perspective. Kind of those three perspectives, this philosophy of science, this kind of modern cognitive science and artificial intelligence is kind of what gave rise to the sequences as the series of essays. And after he kind of more and more people got interested in that topic, he moved from Overcoming Bias to his own blog and later on community forum that he called LessWrong. He named it LessWrong mostly because he asked Bostrom about what a good name was, but one of the key inspiring quotes was this poem, Road to Wisdom, as I think it's called. That's like, what is the road to wisdom? It's simple to explain. You and but less and less and less. And it's this kind of core idea of like, it's going to be really hard to figure out, like to build a perfect model of reality, to get everything perfectly right, but you can aim to be less wrong in everything that you believe. And this is also kind of entwined with a lot of the Bayesianism that is entwined in a lot of the thinking that Eliezer put into the sequences. That's kind of this idea that there's this ideal standard of kind of Bayesian epistemology that's not really implementable by humans, but it gives us a framework for thinking about if we had infinite computational resources and infinite time to think and a lot of things that we don't have, what is the maximum of kind of like cognition that we could achieve? And then over the following years, go ahead.
And I think that was also through the sort of mindset of, I think, a lot of successful science in the 20th century. There was searching for like fundamental laws and some of the basic rules of how the physical systems worked. Similarly, I think LessWrong and Eliezer was very much inspired by attempts to find fundamental laws of reasoning and information that people discovered in probability theory and information theory, and that was part of his work on artificial intelligence. If you know of Bayes' theorem, it gives certain restrictions on how much information one can get from a certain amount of input data or something like that, which is a very shocking and kind of surprising result, and certainly changed a lot of how I think about reasoning. Sorry, Habryka, please continue.
Thanks. Yeah, and then over the following years, the community grew kind of between 2010 and 2015, like LessWrong just had more and more activity on it. And of course, at some point in the early 2010s, Eliezer started writing Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality, which some people maybe know, which ended up being a Harry Potter fan fiction that tried to combine a lot of the ideas from the sequences and the things that he wrote and fiction. Still one of my favorite books, probably my favorite book.
And it is on many metrics, I believe, the most successful piece of Harry Potter fan fiction on the web, which is
true. It is quite surprising. It's definitely just really captured that market. Then in around 2016, Eliezer decided to take a bit of a step back from a lot of his working on LessWrong and decided to focus more on his work with the Machine Intelligence Research Institute, where he did a bunch of work on AI risk and AI research. And in the years kind of between 2015 and 2017, kind of the site as whole declined, and a lot of the community kind of dispersed to a lot of different locations. At the time, that's of course when a lot of Scott Alexander and Slate's Codex got a lot of traction. And that then was the time when a whole community formed around that. And then around 2017, I was kind of pretty sad about the decline that happened to LessWrong. And I decided to sit down with the kind of benevolent dictator for life that was appointed, Vannevar/Matthew Graves. And we decided to try to revive LessWrong. And then I formed a new organization and we kind of built a whole new software platform. And then in 2017, we launched a new version of the site. And since then, kind of growth has everything, like the site is very much growing again. There's a lot of activity. And I think in an important, meaningful sense, it has kind of become like close to the heart, or at least one of the strong epicenters of the rationality community.
Yeah, I think rationality over those years saw a lot of, certainly the online community saw a lot of competition from various social media platforms like Facebook and Tumblr and Twitter and so on. And so while LessWrong still does some of those activities, it like is a place where meetups are organized. For example, a lot of Slates.Codex meetups are organized using LessWrong. It is in many ways also one of the primary functions that we currently holds is as a publishing platform for a lot of like the research and ideas and interesting people's ideas and projects that they have throughout the rationality community. And that's one of the things that's done, I think, quite well over the last 3 or so years.
Of course, like a lot of my motivation for working on LessWrong and why I'm here definitely has a lot to do with just trying to prevent existential and global catastrophic risk. I think humanity is in a very crucial period where it just seems quite plausible that we will not exist and just basically all be dead within the next 20 to 50 years. And that seems very bad and should probably be prevented. And there's something like, there are very few things that feel as obviously good and obvious to dedicate your life to as trying to just prevent everyone from dying. It's like one of those things where just like morality is really complicated, and like, man, there's like how much the suffering versus pain, like was happiness way up and which kind of experiences are good, but like just a lot of the things just aren't really working out if everyone is dead. So in some sense, a lot of my dedication is trying to kind of help humanity navigate this very crucial period in its history. And currently at the moment means most of my focus is on the risks that arise from artificial intelligence, because that kind of seems like if you view the history of humanity, it seems quite plausible that like artificial intelligence are going to be the successor to the human species in an important way. And basically whatever we build will determine the future of at least like the universe as we know it. Cool. I think that's a rough history and overview that helps hopefully some people a bit orient a bit and didn't bore the people who have all the context already too much.
And I guess I might add in a few more words about some of the things we've done over the past 3 years. I'm happy to take questions on any of these things or none of these things, but in terms of what we've actually been doing, I think as Ollie mentioned, there's a whole new like web forum software which Ollie was the prime architect of, which you also see is our sister movement, the Effective Altruism people. They also use the same forum software for their forum. We have been trying to support researchers in the who work on AGI and who work on topics related to rationality and help them however we can. We've begun an annual review process to review the content that happens in a year and have a vote from the core members of LessWrong using quadratic voting. And this year, for the first time, we turned the best posts out of LessWrong into a book set, which Oliver and Peter showed and will show again, which I'm going to quote Peter as saying they were very beautiful earlier, and I'm going to hold him to that, partly because I think that Ollie's quality of camera is not as good enough for you to be fully convinced of it. Yeah, we turned it into books and a number of different things, yeah, which we could go into more detail on. But yeah, that's what we've been working on for the past couple of years.
Yeah, that's a great, I think, great intro to LessWrong. And so I'm going to slightly modify. James has a question, because I can tell that this crowd is interested in the ideas of post-rationality and meta-rationality, which is to go beyond the, I don't know, stereotypical curriculum of LessWrong. But I want to actually expand that question out a little bit to look at the life cycle of somebody who might be approaching this community. Like, how do people come across rationality? What types of people are attracted? Maybe what is it that nourishes them within this community? And then where do they go? What are some of the common reasons people move on from rationality communities? Yeah, so curious about what you guys sort of take with that.
Yeah. Like, I guess there are two answers. There's something like, I think there are a bunch of good reasons to get involved, like to be interested in the rationality community, a bunch of, I think, reasons that are human and make sense and often are good and bad, and some bad reasons for getting involved with rationality. And I think they're all present. So if I'm trying to figure out like, why do people seek out this community, and why do people seek out LessWrong? I think at the core of it is something like at the core of it is something like trying to, like, people who are just really trying to figure out how the whole world works, and who are trying to like apply all the tools that humanity has built like in the last like 300 years probably before then, but something like there's like an industrial revolution that happened and we're like in a very different world, to understanding how the world works. And it's like, it's not the only thing, but it's something like, I think it's pretty, like when I look at something like, you can be like, where do I go if I want to understand how the work works? And you could go into something like academia, but there's something about the modern academic culture that feels a bit broken and sad to me, even though many pockets of it seem very healthy and good to me. And I think there's this perspective of, I would like to be in a place that has a more, that has a healthier relationship to the truth, that has a healthier relationship to how to make intellectual progress or something like that. That I think is one of the big things that attracts people. I also think there's just this sense of we're just currently, humanity is at this point where I think we have a shot at understanding the foundational rules of cognition in a way that 100 years we did not. Because we kind of understand what foundational rules even are. And we, like, with things like artificial intelligence and cognitive science, you can just kind of start understanding how the human mind works in ways that wasn't really possible at any previous point in history.
I also think there's a certain spirit, just this is on the good reasons rather than the neutral reasons and the bad reasons, which I also have a bunch of comments on. I think it was a community, and it is a community that cares a lot about reasoning and actually understanding the world, and believes the world is understandable. I think that there's like a positive and a negative way to get into this, both of which are important. By positive, I mean, well, I think the negative one is often important when you realize that to a certain extent, all the people around you are insane and you actually have to think for yourself. I think many people have, Luke Melhauser, who was one of the people who was very foundational to LessWrong, went through a sort of deconversion experience from his sort of evangelical Christianity. And I think that's a situation where he realized that his family and his friends and his community were sort of reliably insane about a topic in a way that he couldn't trust their reasoning and had to start trusting his own and had to start thinking for himself. I also think you can see people in the world, on the more positive side, I think you can see people in the world who reason about the world, who say, make plans in the world and follow those out. I think Elon Musk is an example there of someone who said, I think, for example, with making humanity multiplanetary, which is a laudable goal, although not my primary interest at the current time. He was able to see multiple steps on a path that actually were necessary. He said, okay, first we need to make rockets where you don't have to remake the rocket every time you want to fly. And then we need to be able to sell that in a certain product in a way that is providing value along the way. And he's doing it step by step, and similar with the electric cars. And so I think there's both examples of things that can go very bad if you don't think for yourself, and things that can go very well if you do think for yourself. And I think that's something that the LessWrong community cared about, and you could meet a lot of other people that sort of cared about this thing. I think that was one of the attractors.
Yeah. I could go a bit into the, like, I mostly want to be like, yep, and I realized that, like, not everyone, like, I think sometimes people are looking for a certain type of reassurance. I think sometimes people are seeing something in the LessWrong space, which I think that's one of the human understandable reasons. I think there's this thing where, like, I think, like, there's a thing that religion did, and I think there's a thing that's, like, having a story of the world did, that, like, a lot of people who are no longer religious in the modern world are lacking. And I think, in particular, Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality, but of course also many parts of LessWrong, provided something like a meaning and purpose to one's life. And that was a thing that I think attracted a lot of people to it, where there was the sense of, like, wow, I can kind of, it's both that, like, we kind of now have a complete story of the universe, which means that you can tell an origin story of how human life happened, and it's in an important sense, it's of course not complete, but there's something coherent about it. You can kind of extend that into the future and kind of take ownership of our own destiny in a way, I think, that provided meaning to many people that felt lost in kind of a relatively postmodern world or something like that.
That's so beautiful. I think just that last bit. I think, and I draw my inspiration from the adult development community, and even to a certain extent, some of the spiral dynamic stuff. When it feels like a certain way of thinking for a lot of people, you move past it, like the socialized mind, when you realize that the stories that you've been told by society, they stop providing necessary answers, and rationality almost provides a new platform with which you can reconstruct how you understand the world. You can say, oh, most of my beliefs used to be because people told me things. wait, I can actually build my own beliefs from first principles, more or less, and here's some of the techniques that allow me to do such a thing. It's a transformative way of rebuilding your worldview. And so for our next question, I'm going to tag in Daniel, because I think
pardon me interrupting. I did want to make sure, I don't want to evade questions. I think if you wanted to
I was
follow up
about to answer the second part of the question that was like, why do people move on? And
I didn't want
why...
the person to feel like we had avoided
Correct.
the crux of the question.
This is all setting it up so that I can answer it.
All right. That's why I was going to tag in Daniel to ask what about meta rationality? What happens when the tools of science sort of break down? What do we do then?
I mean, my primary response is just like, look, that's the whole point of LessWrong. I'm like, yes, the whole point of LessWrong is that the tools of science break down. You don't take a verificationist stance towards the world. And like, of course, they're like, I don't know, there's always this classical high school model of science that like everyone is being told, where it's like, hey, you like science works by like, you have a scientist, question mark, question mark, question mark, very big box. Scientist produces hypothesis, other scientists test hypothesis, slightly smaller question mark about what the hell does it mean to test a hypothesis. And it's like there's something like, of course that doesn't work. Like that's not a coherent like epistemology. There's just like lots of things that are messing there. How do you relate to ontologies? How do you relate to concepts? How do you relate to stacking concepts on top of each other? In particular, if you don't know whether any of them are grounded, how do you relate to like various things like the hard problem and like easy problem of consciousness? Like,
what do you do if you can't think of any hypothesis that could possibly explain your confusion?
Yeah. What do you do if it turns out two of your hypotheses are actually mutually contradictory, but you don't realize it because it would take a really long time to think about it to realize it? So there's this underlying thing where I think coming back to one of the bad reasons for why people get engaged with the community that I think kind of creates a story of my personal story of what is kind of going on with post-rationality and a bunch of things like this, is that one of the reasons why people get engaged with LessWrong is because it's kind of almost the opposite of what we just said, where they don't feel like they are allowed to think and they're looking for some justification that is really, really grounded for thinking or something like that. They're like trying to find something that's like rigorous and real and obviously true and authoritative that like gives a new foundation for deciding about how to live your whole life. And there's something like, oh, maybe I can use something like probability theory plus expected value calculations as like the thing that I like built my whole life around. Not because it's like the thing that I want, but it's because a thing that I'm like trying to desperately grasp in order to like both in order for like me to believe that I'm allowed to think these thoughts or something. It's being like, hey, what is the framework in which I get to justify my beliefs? And there's this, like, cool. LessWrong gives you a framework in which you get to justify your beliefs, and also a framework in which you kind of get to dismiss everyone else's beliefs. It's like, well, they don't do the weird Bayesian, like, probability estimates plus expected value theory. So, like, that means I get to, like, not really have to think about whether their opinions are true. And that gives me a sense of grounding, because now the world becomes much smaller, because this, like drastically reduces the space of, like, hypotheses that I have to consider.
Yeah, I think there was a period, even in my life, where I felt like I understood how to take many things that were well formatted in the way I currently understood the world, and then I could take them, I could evaluate them as like true or false, and then think about them. And if they didn't come well formatted, if they didn't explain themselves in a way that I felt was very easy to understand, then I would ignore them and I wouldn't I wouldn't engage with them. And I would say, I wouldn't be quite so forthright, but I would say, you are not like playing the right game of how to have conversations. And this world felt simple, and I don't want to say that it was like totally unhelpful or something. It did, like, I was able to think fairly carefully about some things I cared about a lot, but I was unable to engage with a lot of just other schools of thought and other ways of thinking and other people for a while there.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this is like, if you look at the history, there's of course a very strong inspiration from the skeptics community and kind of the new atheism community in its early stages, where it was kind of obvious that like the people who joined at like kind of for that reason were looking for a mechanism that would allow them to disprove religion. And I think looking for a mechanism to disprove religion because they understand that it's wrong and they kind of picked up on a bunch of stuff in that space is very useful. But it's also kind of like, and like a lot of people I think entered with the mindset of, this is a system that allows me to disprove more things. So I can finally be free from those constraints because I feel kind of socially stuck in a bunch of these systems, and also because they are wrong. And I want to find some way to prove to other people that they are wrong. And this place gives me the tools to disprove all of these. So when I'm thinking about, in particular, when I'm talking to this audience, like what would have caused people to be alienated from the rationality community and LessWrong, I think it's very much in this space. It's something like they had experiences where they were talking to people that were walking around trying to disprove a lot of things without having any ability to constructively generate hypotheses, and without really being interested in understanding the world, more like being interested in deconstructing more and more things or something like that. And I think that's, yeah, I expect that has over the years annoyed and alienated many people. I think there's also just like a completely separate school when I'm thinking of specifically post and meta rationalism, where there's just like David Chapman, who just uses the word rationalist to refer to a completely separate thing that has nothing to do with LessWrong, and it confuses everyone, and it's terrible.
Just yesterday, I was finding someone's blog who was writing some very thoughtful critique of some stuff on LessWrong, saying, and yes, David Chapman has written an extensive critique of this rationalism school. And I really wanted to just email the guy and be like, here is David Chapman's tweet saying he has not read LessWrong and he doesn't understand LessWrong and he is not replying to LessWrong. So yeah.
Yeah, so there's this underlying thing of there's definitely a lot of people who are like, man, I don't think I would ever fit into LessWrong, because they think it's referring to the historical school of rationalism, because that's what David Chapman is referring to. And that's just one of the saddest reasons for people to bounce off of all of that stuff. I'm like, look, it's just not the rationalists in the historical philosophical sense. I'm sorry for choosing that name. It was probably confusing. I didn't make that choice. Someone should have chosen the better name in 2010.
I'm totally curious about, I like that you mentioned David Chapman. Who's an author who writes extensively. Well, the meta-rationalist space would consider him to be one of the more core authors. And I'd also like to bring in a thread, Oliver, from your experience with CFAR, which for those on the call who aren't familiar, it's the Center for Applied Rationality. And they do teach techniques like focusing, and some things that would not typically be seen in the straw man version of rationality, like actually learning to work with emotional processes and systems. So I'm curious to hear from you guys. What do you think about the meta-rational space?
Yeah, go ahead.
Just FYI, I have never heard the term meta-rational. I've only heard the term post-rational used until you've started chatting about it now. Pardon me for not reading enough on the terminology involved. Habryka, did you want to add something?
Yeah. I mean, I'm mostly yep. I don't know where I'm like for me, I guess I'm maybe not that excited about names. I'm like, what do I care about the meta-rational space? And I'm like, I don't know. It seems like some people are trying to do some of the same things as I'm trying to do. I think sometimes they're using it with a bunch of assumptions that seem kind of wrong to me. I think I like almost all of David Chapman's stuff. I think he's wrong about a few things, but almost all of it seems good. I think almost all of it fits into LessWrong and the rationality stuff. So I'm like, cool. It doesn't really feel out of place. And so my feelings are mostly, I would judge it by the same standards as I would judge the contributions that of the people that I'm talking to kind of in the heart of LessWrong. And I think some of the stuff there is really useful and insightful, and some of the stuff is pretty confused. I think there's definitely some associative perspectives of something like, I think Chapman has this problem less, but some of the broader post-rationality stuff, I think, has this a bit more of something like, I sometimes feel like stuff is not grounded sufficiently or something like that, in the sense of there's something very grounding about the hard sciences. I think it is just really important to realize that we have used the hard sciences and have used them to transform the world beyond our wildest imaginations, from 1,000 years ago. And we have just clearly demonstrated that there's something to this type of thinking that is extremely powerful. And I think Chapman gets this. I think many other people, both on LessWrong and in the broader kind of surrounding community, don't get this. And that often feels to me like it's a bit missing.
I just popped into the chat. One person that I think fits this is Kai's posts.
Yep, absolutely.
So I put in one of his sequences where he gets more into talking almost about like emotional theory and some therapeutic stuff, but from the way that he describes it, I think is beautiful, because he applies this like beautiful rational language to explain different processes in thinking, which are typically beyond probability theory. And I love that it's all included within LessWrong, and there's great discussion on each of these pieces.
I think one of the things I really like about Kai's writing is that he holds himself to a standard of, this shouldn't be confusing. What if I understand this well enough? I should not have lingering confusions remaining about why any of this even works or why any of it even makes sense. And is very willing to spend a lot of effort looking very, very closely at his own experience, like the way it's impacted his life, and like thinking about like ways it's impacted his life, and at the same time trying to talk about things that to many people feel very confusing, whether he's talking about meditation or enlightenment or something like that. And I really like the joint depth of curiosity and a certain level of rigor or something, that I would say.
Yeah, I just want to just like thumbs up to, if you want to read somebody who can speak the rational language, trying to describe enlightenment to other people who speak rational language, it's a really cool example of mimetic mediation, if you will, explaining something from one field into the language of another.
Yeah, I think he had a great post, which is in the books. There's this essay, which I think was a response to a different essay by Valentine Michael Smith, which I believe who he does, I think, a bunch of talks for you guys and who I know, where Val was talking about some interesting things, and Kai was like, I want to make this point real clear. His post is called Explaining Insight, Meditation, and Enlightenment in Non-Mysterious Terms. And it's a brilliant essay, and I learned a lot from it. I recommend people check that one out. / you can buy the books if you like.
Yeah, I think there's another thing that is important kind of about the intellectual history of LessWrong, as well as the history of science, in which I think it is very deeply embedded in, which is that the medium of communication of both LessWrong in particular and the sciences was, of course, the written word. And I think there's a thing that has alienated many people, including myself in an important way, where if you try to, like, the tools that you have available, if you only have the written word accessible to you, and sometimes diagrams, it's just not as much if you're trying to talk about what means, like what it feels like to reason from the inside of a messy human mind. There's just like a lot of stuff that is in the higher bandwidth communication space and in the experiential space that you just have a really difficult time communicating. And I think you can do kind of a lot of interesting hacks to still get more of it. I think of as kind of Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality as kind of Eliezer trying his best to like work around that. He's like, man, I've written like 1 million words of prose, 2 million words of prose trying to explain these rationality principles. And I noticed that most people look at it and kind of relate to it the way to relate like to like a set of tables or like a Wikipedia article or something like that, of a set of abstract facts that you're supposed to hold at a distance. And he's like, okay, how can I get people to actually understand what it feels like to do good thinking from the inside? And he's like, well, one tool that we have is storytelling. That's this like incredibly powerful tool where I can just set up this whole context, social context, personal context, situational context, and then describe what it feels like to be a person from the inside. And that gives you this, it doesn't necessarily give you more bandwidth, but it's this other perspective from which to try to patch a lot of the holes that you have from only being able to do make declarative propositions and kind of ignore a lot of the experiential space.
Yeah.
And I think
HPMR, for me, I learned a lot from it. I remember, I will describe something about it, and I won't give spoilers away. But there's a point toward the climax of this book, and this book is about many things, but in some ways it is about a smart like teenager or something. And I think many books about smart, I've read, Artemis Fowl as a kid, and I really enjoyed those. And I remember at the climax of one of the Artemis Fowl books, there was like a chapter sort of without Artemis in it or something, and you're like, oh no, what's happening? And things look bad. And then he came in and he like saved the day, and he like knew what was going to happen, and he like outthought the other guy, and he like won. And it was a really exciting book. But the interesting thing that happened toward the climax of HPMR was there was an incredibly difficult and complicated scenario that Harry is in. and someone is making demands of him, and it seems he's being pushed into doing a certain thing, and he says, "Stop! I need to think about this." And the person says, "We do not have time." And then Harry's like, "I have 5 minutes. I need to actually think about what the hell is happening and what is going on here." And he stopped and he turned around and he thought. And this chapter at this peak sort of tension point is a extended train of thought of how he thinks about the situation, and he takes wrong turns, just as real scientists and real mathematicians do when they're working with difficult problems. He like goes down a track and he's like, I can't figure out what to think, where this leads or what this explains. All right, cut it back, let's generate a different hypothesis, let's try this. And you got to see someone in real time in a certain way think through a very difficult situation that was very tense and very sort of climactic, and he comes to an important realization about the situation that it's in, which is that it is of a very different danger level than he thought it was in some important ways. And this for me was one of the, I remember where I was when I was reading it. It was an incredibly intense reading experience. I was on my couch in the UK at like 3 a.m. because it came out in really terrible times for Britain, the book. And that's something that stuck with me as I've like led other projects in life and done like difficult things, is that, you know, when the going gets tough, stop, drop, and think carefully about what's going on, even if it kind of would look somewhat socially weird to actually try and figure things out for yourself and think for yourself at this time. I say that just riffing on how Habryka is saying that it's a different medium of communication. I think I got that from HPMR in a way that I didn't get it from the sequences, even though I got many great things from the sequences.
To briefly finish my sentences.
Oh,
I promise it will only be half a sentence. And there's this thing where I think some of the post-meta rationality space, I think, is moving a lot into trying to fix a lot of the constraint that I think comes with the kind of, in some sense, crippled modality of having only access to text. And I think a lot of the things that when people think about what is post-rationality, what is meta-rationality, I expect them to be, what is the type of stuff that's hard to communicate in text? What is the kind of stuff that's hard to communicate in the written word only? And where does the art bloom when we explore those modalities?
I would love to see that as a tweet on Twitter. Like, I would like that and tweet it. I think you just put really nice words to, again, something quite difficult to describe. And I'm wondering, because I really like James' question there. James, do you have a shirt on? Like, do you want to read this question, or do you want me to read your next question?
Do you have a shirt on is my go-to Zoom introduction question. Thanks.
My chest is no longer bare. Let me scroll and find my question. So in a post-mortem of the sequences, Yudkowsky writes, the first largest mistake in my writing, which was that I didn't realize that the big problem in learning this valuable way of thinking was figuring out how to practice it, not knowing the theory. So as far as I know, we have CFAR, but their services are basically inaccessible unless you have the means to travel to the cities that they're running their workshops. So do you guys see if there is a way to scale the practice of rationality as opposed to just the theory?
Yeah, I think
go ahead, Ben.
Thanks. I think there's different kinds of practice. I cannot give you like write me a 10-word essay on how to be a great physicist or something. I cannot give you simple exercises that will create you into like a master of your art. I think that said, I do. There are many exercises that certainly I have spent a lot of time practicing that I think have helped me understand the world and how to think about it in my own mind. And just, I'm sure Ollie will say something else interesting, but I'll just share some of those exercises that I would recommend, or that I've done myself. I think the three standard ones I tend to chat about are Fermi estimates, calibration training, and thinking physics. Fermi estimates are, I don't know if you know about scientists like Enrico Fermi, who are able to deduce a great deal about the world just from what they knew in their own minds. Fermi estimates are simply questions where you ask someone to predict to give the answer of some quantity, typically, in the world, without using Google, typically, and just come up with it from their own mind using some simple equations. And it is shocking the extent to which I remember being shocked by this when I was about 16, and I would just go around to random people I would meet and ask them to tell me how many airplanes took flight that day. And first they'd go, what? And then I go, no, go on, try. And I would like help them walk through a calculation. And there's a couple of ways you can figure it out. And people just reliably can answer that question within a factor of 2. And then we Google it and get the, confirm that answer. And I think that's a really healthy way of trying to understand the world, is trying to build out your understanding from things you know to be able to predict things you didn't think you would be able to know. I also think there's, I mentioned calibration training. I'll not go into too much detail on that, but that's where you try to make a lot of predictions and try to really learn what it means for you to believe something with 80% probability versus 70% versus 20%, and learn these distinctions in your own mind. And that's a very well-defined sort of set of exercises. And Thinking Physics is a lovely book of physics problems that are incredibly simply asked and incredibly simply answered, and it's relatively counterintuitive. I had a whole year where me and my best friend Jacob Lagros, every, I think, Wednesday morning for about an hour or two, just sat with some of these problems and really spent time with them and took time with them until we felt incredibly confident, like 95% confident sort of the output. And that taught me a lot about how to understand the world. We learned pretty quickly on that our clever philosophical arguments about what was right was way less good than actually going and running a little test, like dropping some things, or like calling our friends that like sailed boats and asked them questions, or recording things in slow motion with our video phones. I add that just as like examples of sorts of exercises that I think can be valuable in becoming more rational. Habryka, did you want to add something?
I mean, my perspective is just like, yes, of course, like that's what the whole community is about. I'm like, yes, that's why you build a community. And I'm like, ideally you test yourself against reality all the time. I think I have 2 big questions. Like, how do you practice rationality in terms of like learning the current best state of the art, and how do you develop the art of rationality, which I think are 2 somewhat different questions, even though I think they should ideally be deeply entwined. I think to practice the art of rationality, I almost always think like the very core that I think has always been at the center of like CIFO workshops, given that we used them as an example here of like a place that might have some piece of the art, is when I think of what is the primary end goal I'm trying to get to, if I'm trying to teach at a CIFO workshop, it is getting people to the state where they can start iterating on how they think. It is really not very much, like you're really not giving them that much knowledge about their mind. First of all, because you don't know their mind. Second of all, because minds are kind of complicated and it's hard to give declarative knowledge of it. And third, because it's only a weekend workshop and it's hard to just give you a lot of knowledge. So the key thing is something like, how do I get to a state where the other person can take their own mind as an object, understand how they think, and then just improve it as they just keep going through life and solve the problems they really deeply care about. My favorite class kind of for that reason is Trigger Action Plans, which is this very specific class. It's just like, hey, what happens? It's this class where you're just like, hey, one way you can think of as your mind. This is not the only way. This is definitely not a complete theory of the mind. It's just a large pile of if statements, if you think of it from a programming perspective. It's just like, sometimes you will get a stimuli. That stimuli will have an associated response, and you have control over those stimuli response pairs. You can like train new stimulus response pairs. It's kind of like a slight model of behaviorism. And this is of course not a complete model of the mind, but sometimes in the middle of the class, I see this light going up in one of the students who's just like, you notice that they had this box of how their mind works, and it was just empty. It was just like, I'm not allowed to have a model of my mind, or like, I don't really know. I don't know how I think. It's just like, I am experiencing my own mind. I'm not thinking about my own mind. And then suddenly they are like, oh, maybe I can just like fill that slot with just like, it's a large pile of if statements. That's a model that's simple enough that I can understand it. And now I can like look back at my last week and be like, which things did I do if I view my life through that pile of if statements? And suddenly they just have anything to put into that slot. And now they can be like, oh, this model must be wrong in this ways, because sometimes I don't behave as if I'm an if statement, or this thing feels a bit too long chained. But the key thing is that suddenly there's this object in their mental map that allows them to iterate on it at all and see it as a cause of their behavior, as a cause of their emotions, a cause of their experiences. And that's kind of at the very core of where I think rationality practice comes from. So when I'm thinking of like what's like, have found it that insight is surprisingly hard to get across outside of a weekend workshop, but not impossible. Many people who I've talked to over the years just like obviously can take their own mind as an object and iterate on it in many important ways. Outside of that, I think most of the practice is going to be people trying to do hard things. And I think in some sense, that's like a thing we have succeeded at, also a thing that I think we're not doing enough, where I think the key art of the development of the art of rationality should happen when people are facing really, really difficult world scale problems. I think this means we should aspire to be really great scientists. I think we should aspire to build really great companies. I think we should aspire to form communities and countries and like institutions that are better than anything that has ever come before in human history. And those are really, really hard challenges. And in order to overcome those challenges, you will have to figure out how you can get better at figuring things out. And while solving those problems, I think you will learn a lot. And then we just need to have good institutions to share that knowledge, which I think lots of workshops individually, lots of people, like people writing books, people writing articles, people talking to each other, people trying to share experiences with each other. And that's kind of how, like when I'm thinking of where I want kind of the whole rationality community to go over the next 10 years, it's this feeling of, I want to be this community that has achieved amazing world scale things. And while doing so, at every point has asked itself, why was I able to do this? And why wasn't I able to succeed before? And how can I share this fact that I got better with other people?
I agree so much with that. I look forward to seeing where LessWrong goes in the next 10 years as well, especially if it holds that as a bit of a guiding light for them.
Thanks. I wonder, I think we've given fairly extended answers to
I'm
questions.
sorry.
If it's the case that there are like 20 backlog questions, I'm more than happy to try and do lots of them quickly.
Hey, we can try. We can try.
Like, but I'm not reading. Go on.
Yeah, I think I'll pass things over to Peter. You mentioned that you had a culture war question. and if folks do have more questions, feel free to pop them into the chat. And we could go a little bit more rapid fire, I guess, but let's see Peter's question.
Sure. So one thing I've studied extensively is the culture war and different intellectual spaces. And one of the battlefronts in the culture war I see is the woke versus anti-woke. And I see a lot of intellectual spaces, whether it's integral theory, authentic relating, the new atheist movement, that kind of battlefront exists in the last 4 or 5 years into those movements. And the people I've talked to, the rationalist community, they say that is present there as well. So I just wanted to inquire into that and see what your take is on that. If you even agree with the framing, first of all, and if you do, is that happening in the rationalist community?
Yeah. I think LessWrong, we've often had a pretty good norm of avoiding the sort of political and cultural wars that have been happening on the internet. I remember chatting with David Friedman one time, and he was like, "Oh, I love here's a comment section I really like because I get to talk with people with all sorts of different political worldviews other than mine, and this is great and healthy." And I was like, "Oh yeah, I like to think we have that on LessWrong, except we don't talk about politics. We talk about more interesting things." So I think for a lot of LessWrongers, I don't really know their politics, and I don't really know their stances on a lot of such issues. And I'm not like against politics. It's not like it's not totally like banned on LessWrong or something. But certainly it's like not of primary interest. It's not especially interesting to me. Yeah. Not that it's not interesting in general, but it's just not like I think one of the things we focus on.
My framing on it is something like right now, just really trying to figure out how to make humanity not go extinct. And I'm like pretty confident, like not absolutely guaranteed confident that everyone agrees that this is a good idea, but I really think almost everyone upon reflection thinks this is a good idea. I think it's just like really like, I yet like to say that like in the like set of like if you imagine trying to like have a political platform where you're like trying to get to a state where like you have an institution that like really like nobody has a particular reason to like be particularly like opposed to, or like, I don't know, I think of, there's kind of this thing where I think a lot of politics is something like very much coming from a zero-sum perspective. There's people thinking about, oh, I have my constituency, I have the people that I care about, how can I reallocate resources from these other parties to people that I care about or fix various inequalities? There's a perspective of how can I just like if you're a politician or something, there's a perspective of like, how can I make sure that my constituency leaves this whole situation at head, opposed like to everyone else? And there's this foundational zero-sum mindset. And I like to think that like, there are very few things that are like really obviously positive sum, but I think reducing the probability that humanity goes extinct is just like really there. It's just like not very many parties that are like, man, it would be better for humanity to go extinct. And so my perspective here is something like, I think in the grand history of humanity, the key thing for this century to figure out is how to not destroy ourselves and how to like get to a state where we get to ask ourselves a lot of the interesting questions about what it means to be human and about how ethics works and various things like this. This means that I think many people these days are trying to ask themselves those questions now. And I think frequently are trying to go to war with each other about answering those questions. And I think sometimes those wars are justified, sometimes they're not justified. But I do think I have this sense of detachment or the sense of strategic relationship to it, where I'm just like, I just really want humanity to survive this period. And so when I'm thinking of where do I fit into the culture wars, I'm like, I really want to maintain our ability to think. I really want to maintain our ability to navigate. But I don't think there's anyone there are not very many institutions that are trying very actively to work against my goals in the sense of trying to make humanity go extinct. I think there are a few. There are some random antinatalist groups, but overall, I don't think they pull very much of the population. And so I'm trying to take this relatively collaborative sense. If like you think of it, there's this kind of similar mistake theory versus conflict theory that Scott Alexander takes a lot about. I think there's a lot of value. There's kind of this foundationally mistake theory, a mistake theory perspective or something like that. Separately, I do also think that like, I think there's a good chance that our ability to think clearly is getting worse. And I think that's really important to realize and notice. I think there's an important sense in which certain parts of science feel broken to me, and like the world at large feels like it is a bunch more bumbling and chaotic than I think it was in the past. And also, it's obviously very, very far away from how good it could be at thinking if you think of humanity as a thing that's trying to collectively navigate kind of the scenario in which we're all in. And of course, making sure that we can keep thinking is essential. And this means sometimes defending people for saying things that seem bad, sometimes fighting local wars in order to not get destroyed by external parties. But I feel all of them, I have this relationship of them being wars of necessity. They're not wars that I like to fight. I don't feel very excited about them. And I don't want to be at war with other people. It's dumb. And some of the culture wars always give me this feeling of like, I want to go to war against the side that's wrong or something like that. And I'm like, I really want to. Sometimes I will have to go to war because you have to, but I don't want to.
Yeah, I think I have many things Ali said resonated. I think I wanted to slightly disagree on something like, I agree there are not like explicitly like antinatalist organizations, but I do think there are a lot of forces out there that sort of want everyone to sort of be with them or against them, or otherwise want to take your resources for them, for their own purposes. Robin Hanson has a great blog post called "Pull the Rope Sideways," where he's like, just like the main big policy debates that are running society, you have no idea the amount of like force and pressure, like keeping that tense, like going, no, more or less of this particular thing, or sorry, not this thing or this thing or something. But policies is like a super high dimensional pace. If you pull the rope sideways, you can actually get a lot more like direct thing in your direction. And I do think that like some of the main tensions through society are like trying to bring everything on their side and like sacrifice everything at the altar of this like main tug of war. And I do feel somewhat like defensive when they like, I have the sense that some of these forces like are like, what have you just made LessWrong all about my particular political issue or something, in a somewhat more aggressive way. And I do feel somewhat defensive against those. But yeah, I agree with, it feels like a pushback of necessity and not like of primary interest, as I said.
Thank you. So we've just got a couple minutes left. And I was really struck by, Oliver, you mentioning that you think that reasoning seems to be on the decline these days, something in that vein. And so one of the practices that we have at CFAR is called Hamming questions or Hamming circles, which is from a scientist named Hamming, who likes to go around and ask other scientists, what is the most important problem that exists in your field, and why aren't you working on it? because inevitably it's something different than what they're working on. So I think I'd like to limit this to maybe just a paragraph from each of you, but I'm going to ask you, what is the most important problem that LessWrong could be working on? And so maybe just take a breath. Let's just introspect a little bit on what this might mean. And then maybe if you could share that with the group, and then I'll pass things over to Peter to sort of close this out. But really curious. So what is the most meaningful thing that LessWrong could be working on?
Could be working on, but isn't, or?
I'll leave that to you. I'll leave that to you. Because maybe you've already asked yourself this question.
Damn, it's a good question, because very much like we try to ask ourselves what are the most important problems that humanity faces, and what are the most important problems that we think we could work on, and then work on those. I guess, yeah, it could be good to try and think a little bit about more which problems are we choosing to not work on that came close.
I think for me, it's two big ones. One that I've already mentioned, and I think it's just, I used to believe we had enough time to kind of punt on this one, but we just definitely need to build a group and community of people that can figure out what to do with artificial intelligence in a way that won't kill us all. Really important. I think there's a second thing of, I want us to develop a community of practice for the art of rationality. I think right now, a lot of what rationality is a community of interest, which I think of as a group of people who have noticed some similar structures and now are gathering together, sharing insights, sharing perspectives, but not really with a purpose of trying to get better or having a sort of incentives that actually really makes it so that it's fun and engaging and are people who feel accountable to getting better. And making that shift from a community of interest to a community of practice really feels to me like the most important thing that we can work on. After, or at the same time, I think those are very deeply entwined with the just really figure out how to make artificial intelligence not destroy all of humanity.
I think this is not the normal spirit of the Hamming question, but I think there are other things that other people are the most important thing in the world to be working on, and I can maybe try and say why I don't work on those. I think several people, the sort of progress studies bunch, which I like them all, are like, just make economic progress go up. It's just great, and everything's better for it, and you'll solve all your I mean, it's very similar to sort of the Y Combinator startup wisdom. It's just like, things, if you've got growth, things are going well. You may have problems, but growth covers the problems and kind of keeps things healthy. And while I don't disagree with both of those claims, I think also one of the things Nick Bostrom has spent his career sort of outlining is the sort of ways, the sort of black swans that are in this urn that you're pulling from, the sort of ways that most technological progress has been good, but occasionally you do pull a thing out, and like the atom bomb nearly was kind of catastrophic, nearly kind of ended everything, and maybe it'll just still turn out to be good because it's such a great source of energy, but certainly we didn't have any way of not, I mean, we could have, but we totally failed to find a way to not have the Cold War, and it was just really bad. And I think we're, pulling more and more interesting technologies out of the urn. And so I'm not interested in growth with abandon in the way that other people are. I could maybe say more detail on that, but societies become more powerful and societies become more wise. And I think we've got a lot of power at the minute, and I think people aren't very wise. And so I'm a bit more trying to push on the wisdom before I push again on the power. I think the effective altruists, who again I like, but I disagree with in some ways, often do fairly sort of naive utilitarian sort of calculations. And naive utilitarian calculations are great, and I do them all the time, and they're just like so much better than what I was thinking most of the time. But yeah, I think I have some philosophical differences around animals about like, you know, I could create a robot that appears to be in pain, and I think, but isn't. And I, reflecting on my feelings about consciousness and experience, I think that many animals are not really in the sort of pain that they appear to be, though a human would be if it was exhibiting a similar sort of stimulus response patterns, whatever. And yeah, I think a lot of the global health stuff that they do, while positive, I think sometimes comes from a feeling of sort of epistemic, or sorry, feeling very uncertain about what is good and wanting to do something that is very reliably good and very clearly good, in the form of just like stopping people dying today. And I agree that stopping people dying is really important. But I think there are more important, but I think you can find, I think the world is complex and you can understand it, and you can find even better opportunities to improve the world. So those are two schools of thought that I think I don't like just fully take on straight away. I might be able to generate more, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we've hit the end of our time today. I see Hannah has another question, but I believe Oliver and Ben, you guys are pretty responsive on LessWrong if people send you notes and stuff. So
we have the small support bubble in the bottom right corner. I tend to respond to it very quickly. Sometimes my girlfriend uses it to message me because I tend to respond faster on our public support channel than I tend to respond to my private messages. So you get some high-end support.
They have very cute responses that the rest of us are just looking, well, I guess Ollie's having a nice time with his girlfriend there.
All right, so I'm going to pass things over to Peter, who's got an announcement to make. And also, actually, sorry, thank you very much, Oliver and Ben, for sharing about LessWrong.
Thank you.
I've learned a lot, and I've been hanging around for 5 years, so it's beautiful to hear from you guys.
Yeah, that was a super awesome session. Thank you, Ben and Oliver, for coming to the STOA. Love to have you back.
Thank you.
Cross-pollination between our communities. And Ryan, thank you for doing an excellent job emceeing. Always love having you at the STOA. So yeah, I'll plug a couple of events. We have a wisdom gym here, by the way. We have all these cool events, and it might be cool to have like a rationality kind of session on a weekly, bi-weekly basis. So that could be something like Vince Horn from Buddhist Geeks, he's having social meditation. So we're having a bunch of people come in and have sessions in our wisdom gym. So I'll plug tomorrow's event. I'll plug a symposium that's related to what was talked about today. So the Quantified Self Movement, the Gary Wolf, the guy is at kind of the head of that. He's coming in tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern time. You can check that out. And we have a symposium next week, March 16th, and I'm sharing my screen. Let us maybe make the meta crisis our superordinate goal. So the meta crisis is the jazzy term, like the kind of the constellation of existential risks and suffering risks that threaten our existence. And then the word maybe is the post-rat in me, because I'm not totally convinced that it should be our superordinate goal. And yeah, we have lots of cool people come in. Jonathan Rosen from Perspectiva, Benita Roy. We have the history of X risks, the X risk complexifying threat environment, doomsday curve from the Lifeboat Foundation. And we got Derek Jensen come in talking about critiquing the environmental movement. So that's a full day event on March 16th. Check that out, all free at the STOA. Everyone, thank you so much for coming. See you next time.
Thank you very much.
The song I'm playing is called The Emotion, by the way.
Nice.